Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Rajni Gamage, a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute. Sri Lanka's political situation is determined significantly by attempts by the present government to recover from the national economic crisis since 2022. The country's economic situation is said to have stabilized, with inflation having fallen to single digits after 2 years, after being one of the world's highest a year ago. In March 2023, Sri Lanka secured a US 2.9 billion IMF extended fund facility arrangement. However, its economic situation remains precarious, with a foreign reserve of only US 3.6 billion reported in August this year, and with foreign debt restructuring still in progress. To understand Sri Lanka's current political and economic dynamics against this backdrop, I am joined by economist and executive director of Verite Research in Sri Lanka, Dr Nishan De Mel. Thank you for joining me today, Dr Nishan.
Thank you, Rajni.
So, to start off the conversation, let me start by asking how you would describe the current state of Sri Lanka's crisis recovery and what some of the key dynamics or markers are.
Thank you for inviting me on this podcast, Rajni. Just to say that Sri Lanka's crisis, of course, could be seen in four different layers. And the aspect that we felt the most last year and was covered in global news is the liquidity crisis that prevented Sri Lanka having enough fuel, not having electricity, shortages of food and medication. And that was really a social calamity. And to a large extent, we have resolved that through suspending debt payments because really the inability to export goods or import goods into the country was because we were repaying our debt, but also multilateral banks, the World Bank, the ADB, the IMF, has injected currency into the country that has enabled Sri Lanka to maintain the basic supply of essentials in the country. I don't mind telling you about a second, third, and a fourth dynamics of the crisis. And the second really was a knock on impact that was the monetary side of the crisis. So, as Sri Lanka repaid its debt without adequate ways of earning foreign currency, we drove our reserves to zero. That's what the liquidity crisis emerged. But that means the exchange rate suddenly ballooned out of control. We had a depreciation of 80%, and inflation also ballooned out of control alongside that with at 70%. So both those things, I would say the monetary side has also been brought under control, mainly driven by sensible policies that has stabilized the exchange rate and inflation in the country. But the two other aspects I think that are still to be resolved are the debt sustainability problem that Sri Lanka has, where many things begin. And of course, Sri Lanka has suspended debt payments. So we don't feel the problem right now. But as Sri Lanka moves to restructure debt, and that's still in process, then the question of debt sustainability still hangs in the balance for the future, whether Sri Lanka can find a path for sustainable debt and restructure debt adequately. Underlying all that, Rajini, I think, is the fiscal management crisis. And this is the essentially foundational crisis in Sri Lanka, where the government earns too little to meet the expenditures that it needs to incur. So, really, Sri Lanka has one of the lowest levels of revenue to GDP in the world. It went all the way down to just around 8% in 2021 and 2022. And I think getting fiscal management right is going to be a critical aspect of Sri Lanka's recovery. And that seems to be moving the most foundational, but also moving forward the slowest. So let me just stop there to say there's a liquidity crisis, a monetary side crisis, a sustainability crisis, and a fiscal management crisis. And we are at varying levels of resolving all of these. But the experience of crisis is much less because of the liquidity and monetary crisis has been substantially dealt with.
Thank you, Dr. Nishan. I think that really kind of set the stage and brought out some of the nuances of the dynamics that are following Sri Lanka's situation. The second question that I would like to follow up on that is that in this context, what are some of the key governance related challenges that the Sri Lankan government faces in carrying out the reforms in the context and in response to the economic crisis?
So I think, looking at Sri Lanka's, what I ended up saying earlier about the fiscal management crisis, undergirding that crisis are two major problems in the structural functioning of Sri Lanka. One is its technocratic capability, and the other is its corruption vulnerability. So, when we talk about technocratic capability, ideally Sri Lanka should be a step ahead of the IMF. We should have our own debt sustainability analysis. We should be able to design budgets that succeed. And we should have institutions that are capable of implementing policies effectively. Now, you find Sri Lanka struggling in all these areas. Sri Lanka was struggling before and continues to struggle in these areas. Currently, revenue is forecast to be 15% under budget, which suggests that these knock on problems are really connected problems of technocratic capability are significant. And Sri Lanka is also struggling to negotiate adequately deep debt restructuring because the technical capacity in the country, I think, is quite low. But connected to low technical capability is the corruption vulnerability that the IMF has also identified and spoken about. So I think you know that Sri Lanka became the first country in Asia to be subject to a governance diagnostic by the IMF. And that signals that the IMF thinks that the problems of governance in Sri Lanka are macro critical, that they're impacting the capability of resolving the macroeconomic problems in the country. And the corruption vulnerabilities are stacked on to problems of transparency, huge lack of transparency with which regard to what government does, and also excessive discretion for the executive to act in ways that may not be reflecting public interest. So, for instance, the tax breaks and tax holidays that Sri Lanka gives, the decisions that are made with regard to projects that are implemented, debt that is taken, expenditure that is undertaken, all these things can become adverse or positive depending on whether to the extent to which corruption vulnerabilities impact them. So I would say, the main challenges, the foundational challenges for Sri Lanka is not simply reducing inflation or getting a stable exchange rate, but setting a path in which corruption vulnerabilities are minimized and technocratic capabilities increased sufficiently to be able to keep Sri Lanka on a path of economic recovery and growth.
Thank you, Dr. Nishan. I think that really identifies some of the key challenges that the Sri Lankan government faces at the moment, as you mentioned, uh, technocratic capabilities, but also in terms of the corruption vulnerabilities it faces. And it kind of brings us back to this the key issues that were identified last year, but also over a long period of time, some of the systemic challenges and weaknesses of not only the Sri Lankan state, but also in terms of how power is consolidated within certain institutions and such. And so, in this context, when we see that these are the problems that continue to persist, but these are also some of the problems of governance that were identified during the people's protests last year, how would you describe the evolution of political legitimacy of the present government? Has political legitimacy increased since last year? And do you foresee more political stability, especially in the lead up to elections that are scheduled for next year?
So, we do surveys, Rajni, on the mood of the nation, we call it, and we look at the approval rating of government. And last year, the in January 2022, the approval rating of government was 10%, and it reduced to 3% by June and July last year. So it was no surprise that the president had to flee the country, the cabinet was replaced. Effectively, what it meant was that the democratic mandate or the electoral mandate that the government in 2019 for the presidency and 2020 for the parliament received was rescinded by the people by their protests due to the way in which the country was managed. But of course, after that, and after the massive protest that we saw, a little bit like the experience of Arab Springs, we found that the protests did not generate its own solution, even though it was very focused on the problem. And so the parliamentary majority, which was the rejected electorally strong party, actually consolidated with a new president who did not have an electoral mandate. So this became an interesting situation because there was a legally valid process by which the new president was elected. But when we talk about legitimacy, it's not the same as legality. So the government has legality, but very little legitimacy. And we've tracked the evolution of that when we looked at the polls afterwards. So the 3% approval rating actually bounced back up to 10% by October last year, and continued to be 10% in February of this year. And of course, these are very, very low numbers. But then I think there's an argument in a crisis, people are willing to suspend some aspects of democracy and prioritize stability. So the idea that we had to continue with the government and the president and try and achieve some kind of stability also has traction in Sri Lanka. And in such a situation, what you find is that people can move away from prioritizing democracy to prioritizing delivery. So, is the government achieving reasonable outcomes? And we found that when the IMF program got board approval eventually in March of this year, the approval rating of government climbed up to 20%. We are in the midst of another poll, so we will know how that's doing. But we think that the approval rating will remain in the 20s. It won't change very much. But the argument for stability and the legality of government means that it is very difficult at this stage, I think, for the society to find a way to change the dynamics of governing power in Sri Lanka. Uh, and we may have to watch that space. As long as the government is seen to be delivering, I think it will derive some form of legitimacy from the delivery aspect, even though the democracy aspect may be lacking.
I think that leads us quite nicely to the next question that we had in mind, and that is that your kind of clarification that, or the distinction made between delivery and democracy. I think that's really useful because then it brings us back again to this conversation of maybe the people's protests last year, but not necessarily that in terms of had we reached a moment where a social contract in Sri Lanka was being, whether a new social contract was being asked for by the majority of the people, and whether people were even questioning what democracy meant. So whether democracy means just political rights, the freedom of speech and such, or whether it also meant more equal access to material rights. And so I would like to ask you the next question, which is what impact you think the ongoing reforms process has on the state of democracy. And I ask this question with the idea in mind that which reforms are being prioritized and the way in which reforms are being carried out. All of these impact democracy. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think Sri Lanka is in an interesting situation with regard to the state of democracy in the country, because, like in any crisis, I said people are willing to sometimes suspend democratic interests for the sake of managing a crisis. So typically in war times, we write into our laws that we give the executive excess power that are normally not part of a democratic contract. During COVID, we saw governments take on excessive power because they were managing a crisis. And a debt crisis can seem likewise a moment of crisis in which society accepts that some democratic freedoms may need to be suspended in order to give the government the license, if at all, to deal rapidly with the problems that are urgent and emergent in the country. So we can see that happening in a couple of ways. For instance, even with regard to programs that the IMF puts forward, there's a great lack of transparency. The IMF negotiates with the government, and it does not publish actually the actions or the commitments. They're not subject to democratic debate. You only find out about it when the IMF board approves, and then it's a fait accompli. So there's a suspension of democracy in that whole process itself, where genuine public engagement, discussion, representation isn't part of the design of IMF programs. And I think that has been somewhat accepted. But there are two other ways in which the state of democracy perhaps is declining in Sri Lanka. One is that the government has also succeeded in suspending elections on the basis that it has no money to hold elections. Now, that is generally not seen as a truthful argument, that it is simply an excuse. But local government elections that were constitutionally due in the March of this year have been suspended in violation of a Supreme Court request, in violation of constitutional sort of constraints. And somehow there is no way to take action because the government has simply sort of warned the judges actually not to pursue the case and threatened them with bringing them before disciplinary committees of parliament, and claimed that the economic crisis is so significant that any money allocated for elections is not affordable. The second way in which democracy might be, in decline in Sri Lanka is by new laws that are being introduced in the country that are seeking to suppress protests. And so we know that even the protests were suppressed violently in the country using the military and other groups that didn't act entirely according to the law. But now there are new laws being introduced, laws on what you can post online, uh, new versions of the Prevention of Terrorism Act that could make any protester of government also be labeled a terrorist. So these things are seen as effectively legally designed toolkits of suppression that could substantially erode basic ability for people to have voice and to be able to express themselves and resist actions of government. So I think, it is one thing if the government was thought to be highly competent and acting with a lot of integrity, like perhaps how Singaporeans feel about their government. But when you feel your government is highly incompetent and has huge corruption vulnerabilities, the suppression of voice and freedom for dissent and protest in this way can feel quite threatening and problematic in terms of rectifying and advancing the country towards economic recovery and development. So, to my own mind, when I look back through history, we've had governments that use extrajudicial means to suppress people, and Sri Lanka has had problematic, declines in democracy in different cycles. But this is one of the worst authoritarian consolidations we have seen in terms of using the instruments of law and suppressing the institutions of the law, because it is not simply kind of illegal extrajudicial action, but the whole system is being converted towards an authoritarian consolidation in Sri Lanka. in ways with actions and means that are quite unprecedented in Sri Lankan history.
I would say that yes, it's quite concerning then to hear you say that this is the state of democracy in Sri Lanka, especially as we know Sri Lanka has had a very violent past, especially in terms of its state violence. And so then to hear of the recent developments and prognosis of democracy going forward, as you mentioned, not just in terms of extrajudicial state violence, but this time rule by law, using legal instruments, using institutions, undermining democratic institutions. I think cause of concern for everyone. Lead this to our final question, which is that in this context of, as we see the government trying to walk a fine line of delivering in the context of an economic crisis, and we can also question what a crisis means, but within this context, then implementing certain measures that undermine democracy, but then at the same time trying to cushion the impact of the crisis on an increasingly impoverished population. What have some of the government's measures or steps been to cushion the impact of the crisis on key social indicators, whether it is unemployment, whether it is poverty indicators, education, and health?
So yes, Sri Lanka is obviously an enormous social upheaval that has. We don't have all the indicators properly lined up, but one of the leading indicators is what's happened to poverty, and we know that poverty has more than doubled and is currently maybe a little above 30% in Sri Lanka. So that's a huge decline in basic social welfare in the country. And the IMF also, I think, recognizing the problem, has said that Sri Lanka should spend 0.6% of its budget or GDP on a social safety net. So, in a way, the IMF itself has asked the government to more than double what it does on social safety net spending, which I think is positive, and the World Bank has offered to finance that. I think, however, Sri Lankans are cushioned not just by government, they're also cushioned by themselves and their families migrating out of the country and having remittances or sending back money to Sri Lanka. So, if you look at the remittances or money that is coming back to Sri Lanka to their families from people who have gone out of the country, that is accounts for 12 times even this expanded social safety net. So what comes back to the country every month is an entire year of this elevated social spending. So really, Sri Lankans have cushioned themselves, and that's why you see even unemployment problems being cushioned, because they have found ways to exit the dependence on the Sri Lankan economy and then use their relatives and resources abroad to cushion their lives in Sri Lanka. The government last year very significantly increased military spending while reducing or not making significant increases to health and education. But this year there is a signal that health spending will be increased. So there is a 27% increase in health spending this year, but almost no increase in education spending, unfortunately. So I think there are moves to do at least the minimum necessary to support those at the bottom end of the income table. And the IMF is also very concerned about that and keeps its focus. But of course, Sri Lanka needs to generate growth, employment, and what we are seeing is that the export sectors are not expanding, and therefore economic growth and jobs are not really expanding. And ultimately, I think the people are not really out of the woods in this kind of scenario. There is a debate or a view in Sri Lanka that Sri Lanka's problems are due to subsidizing the poor. You know, historically, Sri Lanka has universally free healthcare, universally free education. Even though Sri Lanka puts very little money into it, it gets quite a bang for the buck in terms of what it invests in these sectors. But what's interesting is even in the middle of the crisis, you can see that the subsidies given to the rich may outstrip the subsidies given to the poor. Sri Lanka has been passing out very significant tax holidays to very large corporates that are already in existence, even in the middle of the crisis, that is, end of last year and this year. And this comes back to the incentives of the corruption vulnerabilities in the country, that you're finding that those who are politically connected and have a lot of influence on the system, from gambling industry to tobacco industry, to say certain sectors that are politically aligned in the construction industry and other associated areas, are gaining very large concessions and tax holidays and reductions in taxes, even in the midst of a very significant revenue crisis. So I think Sri Lanka does need to shift the balance in how it distributes the pain. For instance, I'll give you one more example. Uh, to manage the domestic debt restructuring, Sri Lanka became the only country in the world in the history of local currency debt restructuring to put the entire burden of that on the pension funds of the average worker, and give banks, private equity, primary dealers a free pass, and in fact, the ability to make windfall profits and gains. So, this gives you a signal that even while Sri Lanka is providing a social safety net, that a large amount of resources and fiscal space that would be available to better protect the vulnerable and advance basic economic infrastructure is being diverted in a way that cushions those with the vested interests. So, without dealing with these corruption vulnerabilities, as the governance diagnostic of the IMF, and in fact, another governance diagnostic done by civil society just prior to the IMF suggests Sri Lanka will find it very difficult to work itself out of this crisis in a sustainable way. What we are learning from these governance diagnostics and the studies associated with them is that Sri Lanka's foundational problem is its governance and corruption. And trying to simply patch up the economy without fixing those problems would be very much like building a house upon the sand. It is unlikely to give Sri Lanka a sustainable and effective economic recovery, which is, I think, the priority to work towards.
Thank you, Dr. Nishan. I think that was a very this conversation was very insightful for myself. It was comprehensive, but also it got into the nitty gritty. So thank you very much for the conversation. I think our listeners from within the region, South Asia, but also Singapore, and this side of the world would also, it was a very good insight into the ongoing developments in Sri Lanka. So you are listening to South Asia Chat. We were joined today by economist and executive director of Verite Research in Sri Lanka, Dr. Nishan De Mel. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.